Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Once again, I apologize for the quality of the audio. I have yet to come back to campus to get my headphones, so I'm just doing this with the built-in speaker on my Mac. Where we last left off is that we talked about those three different gas laws. Boyle's law that talked about pressure and volume being inversely related to one another. We talked about Henry's law, and we talked about the relationship between the solubility of a gas and the way that it's able to dissolve into a liquid. And then we also talked about the partial pressure of oxygen and the partial pressure of gases, and how the partial pressure of each gas is in proportion to the composition or the quantity of that gas that make up all of atmospheric air. So we talked about those pressure laws. We talked about some of those very basic anatomical features, more of which we'll talk about in lab. That refer to the respiratory system. So what we're going to do to finish out the rest of this chapter is that we're going to talk a little bit more about gas transport, and then we're going to talk about some extrinsic controls of regulation, primarily from the endocrine system and from the neural system. So this slide was probably one of the last things that we looked at before we ended our previous session, and that we talked about the relationship between internal and external respiration, and in addition to that, we talked about the relationship between the partial pressures of these different gases. We have a very good understanding now that gases move from areas of high pressure to low pressure. So when we see this partial pressure of oxygen being very high in the arterial end of this artery, we understand that it's going to want to move to where the partial pressure is much lower in the interstitial tissue. So the way that we've been quantifying this so far is that we just say oxygen gets dropped off at the level of the tissue, and carbon dioxide, which has a higher partial pressure in the interstitial tissues, goes to an area of lower partial pressure in the capillary beds. So oxygen gets dropped off, CO2 gets picked up and dropped off as a molecule. Now, this whole process is going to be affected by a couple of different things. First of all, we understand that hemoglobin is the molecule that's responsible for carrying this oxygen and carrying this carbon dioxide. We'll talk about specifically how this drop-off happens. So far, we've just talked about the partial pressure of gases having something to do with that, and that hemoglobin holds on to it, so that's got something to do with it. And we just automatically know that oxygen gets dropped off because the cells need oxygen, and carbon dioxide is a waste product that we want to go back to the lungs to be expelled out. But before we even talk about exactly how that process happens, a little bit deeper into the physiology of it, let's talk about some things that affect hemoglobin. Now, we know hemoglobin is a molecule that's in red blood cells, and it has a high affinity for oxygen. So hemoglobin saturation is just measured as the percentage or the amount of heme units that a hemoglobin molecule can bind to oxygen. The more heme units you can have, the higher your oxygen affinity will be. In addition to that, we also have some environmental factors that can affect your hemoglobin. The partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, so how much oxygen is readily available in the blood is obviously going to determine how much hemoglobin is going to be able to carry. If there's not a whole lot of oxygen to carry, then of course it's not going to be a whole lot of oxygen that it will carry. So what is readily available? Also, the blood pH. Blood pH plays a very big role in the chemistry behind all of this. So how likely hemoglobin is to let go of that oxygen, and how strongly it may or may not be bound to it. So the affinity for it is going to be determined by blood pH. Temperature, same sort of thing with pH, and we're going to look and see at some things that determine how high the affinity is for oxygen of hemoglobin, depending on what that temperature is. And then also metabolic activity within the red blood cells. That directly relates to what we talked about just a second ago as far as the pH of the blood and the hydrogen ions that are available there. It's kind of the chemistry behind what's going on. So the first one we will look at is that we're going to talk about pH first, and then we'll talk about temperature, how that affects oxygen hemoglobin saturation. Standardized, or what we expect to be kind of the norm, if you will, is that the pH of blood is slightly basic, because 7 is neutral, 7.4 is a little bit higher than 7. Anything higher than 7 we consider a base, so it's slightly basic. And then we have normal body temperature at 37 degrees Celsius, which is about 98.9 or 99 degrees Fahrenheit. You guys are very familiar with that. So I'm going to start starring some of these things because they're very important to understand because it's going to directly relate to this discussion that we're having about how does this oxygen get dropped off. We already understand that the partial pressure of oxygen, where oxygen likes to go from areas of high pressure to low pressure, that's going to determine how much oxygen gets released and dropped off at the interstitial tissues. So now we're getting into more of what I consider the biochemistry of the respiratory system. So you didn't know we had biochemistry and just breathing. There's a lot of stuff going on. All right, so the first bullet we're going to start here is that when the pH drops or the temperature rises. So when I say pH drops, that's anything lower than 7.4. So when the pH drops lower than 7.4, even if it's just going to 7.3 or 7.2, that pH is dropping. It's going more acidic. When I say acidic, I want you to think hydrogen ions there, okay? So keep that in mind. So when the pH drops or the temperature gets higher than 37 degrees Celsius, more oxygen is going to be released. So if we have a drop in the pH or we have a rise in the temperature, then we're going to increase the amount of oxygen that's released. So the curve that we have, the saturation curve, is going to actually shift to the right. So you'll be able to see on a couple of slides here, when we look at this oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve, we'll see where it's normalized and we'll see it move to the right, or we can see it move to the left. Conversely, when the pH rises, if it goes higher than 7.4, 7.5, 7.6, or the temperature drops, the temperature goes down lower than 37 degrees Celsius at 36 or 35. And in fact, I'm going to write those things on there so we have something concrete that we're thinking about. So when pH drops, let's say 7.3 for pH, and then we have temperature, I'm sorry, is that so backwards? Let's erase that. I don't know how to erase it. Very sad. Okay, scratch that off of there. When the pH drops at this one, or the temperature rises, and let's say we're at 38 degrees Celsius, then we're going to have more oxygen released. Our curve shifts to the right. When the pH rises, say we're at 7.5 and above, or at this time the temperature drops, we're at 36 degrees Celsius, then we have less oxygen that's released and our curve is going to shift to the left. So keep that in mind. pH drops, we go to the right. pH rises, we go to the left. So here's that normal curve, that standardized curve that we talked about. Now, keep in mind that we're not going to get to 100% oxygen saturation, and if you've ever taken someone's pulse ox, the little thing they put in your finger when you go to the doctor's office, or if you're in the hospital or in the emergency room or wherever when they're doing your vitals, you notice that it never goes up completely to 100, and there's a lot of reasons for that. The partial, and we saw that in the picture with the partial pressure of oxygen in the capillary was 95, but it only went to like 45 or something like that in the interstitial tissue. That, oh, excuse me, you're not never going to have full hemoglobin saturation. So there's our standard curve. So here's our NICLA standard curve. So keep in mind those things that we said that were going to happen. And I'm going to go back here just to remind you that when pH drops, we move to the right. So the pH drops, temperature rises. And so we're just going to keep in mind pH drops. When the pH drops, we're going to go to the right. So this curve, if the pH drops and the temperature rises, is going to move in this direction here. So the effects of pH, when the pH drops below its normal levels, remember we said more oxygen is released, and in fact, let's highlight that because that is pretty darn important. When pH drops below normal levels, more oxygen is released. The oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve shifts to the right. When the pH increases, less oxygen is released, and the curve shifts to the left. So we have a beautiful picture of that happening. So let's talk about pH dropping and moving to the right. That pH dropped down from 7.4 to 7.2. Notice that we had that curve is going to now move to the right, and as a result, we have more oxygen that's released. So see, our saturation was like a 90, 95 when we were standardized, and then it pops down to like maybe an 80, or is that quite 80? More like an 85, so went from like 95 to 85. So we have less of that hemoglobin is being attached to that oxygen, more oxygen is being released. Conversely, if the pH rises, so we have more, or I'm sorry, when the pH increases or rises, we have more of these, less of these hydrogen ions that are available because we're going now from being more acidic. When we were down here, it's a little bit more acidic than this, to now being much more basic. So now that pH has rose, has gone up higher, the hemoglobin is going to hold on to that oxygen much more tightly. It's not going to let go of it as easily as it did before. So if pH drops and more oxygen is released, then remember it's temperature rising and more oxygen is released. So let's look at that graph. So when we look at the standardized hemoglobin saturation curve for temperature, I'm not going to highlight it this time, I'm just going to put a star down here. When the temperature rises, more oxygen is released. So notice that at this point we're at 43 degrees Celsius, much higher than 38 degrees Celsius. So at this point here, temperature rises, more oxygen is released, the curve is going to shift to the right, and then if the temperature gets too low, then you have less oxygen that's released. So the temperature lowers, less oxygen is released. These two concepts of what happens when the pH changes and what happens when the temperature changes, which direction the curve shifts in, make sure that you understand that. So we understand that oxygen diffuses from peripheral capillaries, the high partial pressure of oxygen, into the low interstitial tissues, which have a lower partial pressure of oxygen. The amount of oxygen released depends on the interstitial partial pressure of oxygen. We've already talked about that oxygen gases like to move from the area of high pressure to low pressure. As far as our oxygen reserves are concerned, about up to 3/4 may be reserved by the red blood cells, so it doesn't all get dropped off at one tissue at one time. And that's really all this slide and this discussion is saying. Oh, excuse me. Carbon monoxide poisoning. Carbon monoxide has a much stronger affinity for hemoglobin than oxygen does, and the reason why it's poisonous and can kill you is because it takes the place of oxygen, because hemoglobin has a much higher affinity for carbon monoxide than it does for oxygen. So instead of oxygen being transported to your cells, if you are in an environment where there's a carbon monoxide that's being released, then you're literally suffocating your cells, because instead of carrying oxygen to the cells, you're carrying carbon monoxide, and that results in carbon monoxide poisoning. So hemoglobin and pH, we talked about this. That whole change of pH is called the Bohr effect. So it is a result of pH on the hemoglobin saturation curve, and this effect of pH on the hemoglobin saturation curve is directly caused by carbon dioxide, the molecule that is released after cellular respiration. So we understand that after cellular respiration, carbon dioxide diffuses into the red blood cell. There is a special enzyme, and I'm going to start starring stuff because this crap is important, and it's also fodder for a short answer question. So there is an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, and the job of this enzyme is to catalyze the reaction with water. When carbonic anhydrase reacts, and it's an enzyme, it's an enzyme, reacts with this water, it produces a molecule called carbonic acid. Carbonic acid then can break down into hydrogen ions and a bicarbonate ion. So basically we have an acid and we have a base. The hydrogen ions go out of the red blood cell and they thus lower the pH. What happens when the pH gets lower? on our oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve. So if you do not remember, let's go back and look at that curve. When the pH is lowered, and this is where we are, more oxygen is released. So this whole process, this whole change that's taking place with water combining with carbonic anhydrase, or actually carbon dioxide plus water with the help of carbonic anhydrase, made this carbonic acid, which dissociated into this bicarbonate ion, HCO3-, and this hydrogen ion, and this hydrogen ion was released from the red blood cell that's lowering the pH of the blood, then that's going to catalyze or facilitate the drop-off of that oxygen. Do you see where we're going with this? Before, we just talked about oxygen gets dropped off. It has a little bit to do with partial pressures, and we just know that's what's supposed to happen. The cells need oxygen, the red blood cells have oxygen, oxygen gets dropped off. We are now talking about the biochemistry of exactly how that happens. Carbon dioxide picked up by the red blood cell. There's water in the red blood cell. This enzyme, and I'm going to go back here so you can see these names I'm talking about. Oops. All right, so water plus hydrogen, or oh my gosh, water plus carbon dioxide with this enzyme carbonic anhydrase makes carbonic acid. This carbonic acid breaks down into, there's two parts that it has, and you can kind of see those two parts there. We have hydrogen ions, and then we have CO3. We took one of those hydrogen ions, gave the other one to this bicarbonate here. This hydrogen ion gets released into the bloodstream. When it diffuses out of the red blood cell, the pH is lower. As a result of that pH being lower, because we've already picked up that carbon dioxide, we drop off the oxygen. More oxygen is going to be released to the interstitial tissues. So now, not only do you have an understanding of, well, obviously, I mean, my 8-year-old can tell you that, you know, well, obviously you breathe in oxygen, and that oxygen has to go through your red blood cells to get to all the other cells of your body so that they can make energy, or ATP, and then you pick up their waste product of carbon dioxide and it comes back to your lungs and you exhale that out. Well, obviously we know that. We've known that for quite a long time. But what we now understand is that how this gas is transported depends on not only the partial pressure of oxygen itself, but it also has to do with the fact that carbon dioxide's been picked up, and that causes a metabolic shift on the inside of that red blood cell. There's a biochemical event that's happening in that red blood cell. Fascinating, isn't it? Didn't know breathing had all this to do with it, did you? So hemoglobin and bisphosphoglycerate, red blood cells make ATP by glycolysis. And remember, they have to make it by glycolysis because they don't have a mitochondria, which is a good thing, because if they did have a mitochondria, then their mitochondria would steal all of the oxygen before it got to the interstitial tissues. So as a result, a byproduct of glycolysis is lactic acid and this bisphosphoglycerate. The amount of bisphosphoglycerate that's produced directly affects oxygen binding and release. Another starable moment. When bisphosphoglycerate rises, that increases the pH. If the pH gets increased, what do we know are some things that can happen with an increase in the pH? So we know that if we have a pH increase, then we're going to have it's going to hold on to this oxygen. It's not going to release it very easily. When this phosphoglycerate lowers, hemoglobin just doesn't release the oxygen very well. So in either one of these cases, if it increases, this phosphoglycerate increases, and it kind of sounds a little weird, but I'm going to try to explain it to you. So when bisphosphoglycerate rises, that is an indication of a healthy red blood cell, because we need that red blood cell to make energy and to be able to do its job, that it's not on its last leg, it's not at the end of that 120-day cycle. So when it increases, if that number rises, there's an increase in the pH. So remember we talked about before that not all of that oxygen is released from that hemoglobin. Well, this is one of the reasons why, because we don't get rid of all of that oxygen right away, because there's still other stops that we need to make along the circulatory system. So there are other reasons behind it, so it doesn't all get released off immediately. However, if the red blood cell is on its last leg, it's getting towards the end of that 120-day cycle, and that's an indication that it's about to die. So it's not going to make as much of this byproduct of bisphosphoglycerate. So when it doesn't make as much of this byproduct of bisphosphoglycerate, then it's just not a healthy red blood cell, and it's not really releasing oxygen as efficiently as we would like it to. So carbon dioxide transport, we talked about how oxygen got dropped off and the biochemistry behind that. Let's talk about how carbon dioxide gets transported back into the red blood cell and into the lungs and then exhale out. So carbon dioxide, this you already know, is a byproduct of cellular respiration. It's a byproduct of aerobic metabolism. We know that we had sugar, C6H12O6 plus oxygen gave you carbon dioxide and water. That water we've already talked about, that cooks up with carbon dioxide and, you know, gives you that carbonic acid. So we've already talked about the very first way here. But we know that carbon dioxide is a byproduct of cellular respiration. So there are three ways that carbon dioxide can be carried back into your bloodstream. First one we talked about already, that the water plus the carbon dioxide hook up together with the help of carbonic anhydrase, and they form carbonic acid. That's the first way. The second way, and we kind of did that whole song and dance and talked about how the oxygen got dropped off as a result of that. The second way is that some carbon dioxide is just going to bind to hemoglobin, because there is an oxygen molecule in there, boom, actually too, that some of it will bind to the red blood cells and just kind of piggyback their way on back to through the pulmonary circuit back to the lungs to be exhaled out. And then we have a small portion of it that's going to be dissolved in the plasma. So a good chunk of it, about 70% of your carbon dioxide gets transported as carbonic acid, that H2CO3. Remember, carbonic acid dissociates into a hydrogen ion, an acid, and a bicarbonate ion, HCO3 minus. Whenever you see a little plus sign here, I want you to think in an H, most notably, acid. You see a little negative sign, we're thinking a base here. So at this point here, some hydrogen ions bind to hemoglobin. Some of them are going to leak out of the cell and lower the pH of the blood, which we talked about, and that facilitates the release of oxygen from the hemoglobin from the red blood cell, dropping it off in interstitial tissue. So we kind of talked about that end of it now. But some of it is going to actually bind to hemoglobin. Those bicarbonate ions, this fella here, they're going to move into the plasma by an exchange mechanism called the chloride shift. And what happens with the chloride shift is that the bicarbonate ion goes out of the red blood cell, and then the chloride ions come into the red blood cell. And we're able to facilitate this movement of ions without using any energy. We're going to also talk about this in the digestive system again. It's just that we call it the alkali tide that time as opposed to the chloride shift. But it's basically the same principle. Bicarbonate ion goes out, and then the chloride ion comes into the red blood cell. What that what that bicarbonate ion is carrying is hidden inside of it is a CO2. Do you see that? We got HCO3. We can get a CO2 out of that, can't we? We totally can get a CO2 out of that. So it's hidden in this that we are carrying this carbon dioxide. So some carbon dioxide can bind to hemoglobin, about 23% can bind to hemoglobin, and we call that carbaminohemoglobin. And then just a small portion of it, or a smaller portion of it, is just dissolved into the plasma. The carbon dioxide is just dissolved into the plasma, and about 7% of carbon dioxide gets back to your lungs that way. So here we are looking at those various strategies that carbon dioxide can get back to the lungs. I'm not going to do a whole lot of talking here, so I'm going to let you guys look at this, and then I'll kind of do a quick rundown, but this is just a graphical representation of those three ways we talked about carbon dioxide getting back to the lungs from the previous slide. So you go ahead and have a look at this, and we'll talk about, very briefly I'll talk about it. All right, so notice that we said about 7% just remains as dissolved CO2 in the plasma, and then 93% of it is going to come into the red blood cell where it separates into 70%, turns into this carbonic acid, bicarbonic anhydrase, and that carbonic acid dissociates into this hydrogen ion and this bicarbonate because of the chloride shift here. We got chloride to come in, this bicarbonate moves out into the plasma, and then we have these hydrogen ions, some of which are going to escape and lower the pH of the blood out of the red blood cell, and then some of them will actually bind to hemoglobin. So here is another pretty picture that illustrates everything that we've been talking about as far as dropping off oxygen and picking up CO2, and dropping off oxygen, picking up CO2, that sort of thing. So the first one, for the pickup of the oxygen on here, in the lungs, there's a higher partial pressure of oxygen in the lungs than it is in the red blood cell. Move from a higher partial pressure to a lower partial pressure. It's going to have an affinity for this heme group, the iron in the hemoglobin. So it moves out of the lungs and into the interstitial tissue. As that process happens, things that we didn't quite show yet in this picture, but it shows it down here, that carbon dioxide is getting picked up, releases hydrogen ions out here, drops off CO2, also the partial pressure of, not CO2, drops off oxygen, also the partial pressure of oxygen helps to facilitate oxygen going into the interstitial tissues. This CO2, some of it just goes back to the lungs, it's dissolved plasma, about 7% of it happens that way. FYI, great fodder, as I said again, for a short answer question. That water and CO2 that comes in, it's going to bind together with the help of that enzyme carbonic anhydrase, and we make our carbonic acid. That carbonic acid dissociates into a hydrogen ion. Remember we talked about before that some of that hydrogen ion goes into plasma, lowers the pH of the blood, facilitates the movement of oxygen from the red blood cell to the interstitial tissue. Some of it's going to bind to hemoglobin, which we have here. This bicarbonate ion is going to move out, and it will bring in a chlorine ion on its behalf. So this is in the peripheral tissues. It's when we pick up the CO2. Now, to drop that CO2 off into the lungs, remember part of it has to do with the partial pressure of CO2 being higher in the red blood cell than it is in the lungs, but the biochemistry behind it is we're going to have that chloride shift happen again. This time, that CO3 that has that hidden carbon dioxide in there, we're going to bring that back in, pop that chloride back out. We're going to take the hemoglobin that was holding on to that hydrogen ion. It now will become reacquainted with the bicarbonate, which makes this carbonic acid. Carbonic anhydrase, that same enzyme, can break this puppy down, and it gives us water out of it and CO2. That CO2 then goes to the lungs where you exhale it out. Here's that 7% of CO2 that just got dissolved into the plasma, and we just exhaled that out too. Remember, partial pressure of CO2 higher in the bloodstream than it is in the lungs, so moves from an area of high pressure to low pressure, going from the bloodstream into the lungs now that we're in the pulmonary system. And then we also have that small portion of that CO2 that was held by hemoglobin. Same thing happens, and we exhale it out. Fascinating. Fascinating, is it not? So just take a minute to kind of look at this slide and let all of that goodness digest for you. Fantastic. All right, move on. So local regulation or controls of respiration, just as we have for the other organ systems, we have intrinsic controls and we have extrinsic controls. The intrinsic controls would be for the respiratory system and regulation of gas transport and alveolar function are the levels of carbon dioxide. So rising carbon dioxide levels are going to increase blood flow because they relax the smooth muscles of the arterioles and of the capillaries. This is going to coordinate with lung perfusion and alveolar ventilation that will shift that blood flow. So carbon dioxide levels are definitely going to be part of that local regulation of gas transport. Partial pressure carbon dioxide levels can also control, it makes sense as we're talking about it, control bronchial constriction and bronchial dilation. We then have our extrinsic controls with the endocrine system and the nervous system. The respiratory centers of the brain are found in your medulla oblongata, which is also where your cardiovascular centers are found as well. The respiratory centers specifically are in the pons and medulla oblongata. You have motor neurons that control those respiratory muscles. Remember about all those intercostal muscles, the external and internal intercostal muscles in ANP1. The aponeuristic and pneumotaxic centers of the pons, they regulate respiratory output and rhythmic cycles, so the respiratory rate and the depth or how deep you're respiring. Aponeuristic centers provide continuous stimulation, whereas pneumotaxic centers, they're going to actually do the opposite, and they're going to inhibit aponeuristic centers. So this is going to promote passive or active exhalation on here. So aponeuristic centers kind of constantly providing this stimulation, and then pneumotaxic centers are going to just they regulate the aponeuristic centers. It's a good way to think of it. So sudden infant death syndrome, which is not a topic that no one likes to talk about, so we won't spend a whole lot of time here. We still are not quite sure, even in 2016, exactly why this happens to some infants and why it doesn't happen to others. We do know a couple of things. One thing that we know for sure is that premature babies are more likely to succumb to sudden infant death syndrome than babies born at full term. And we also know, especially if you've had little ones or you babysat little ones, you're probably very understanding of this process, that you put babies back to sleep, which means that you put babies to sleep on their back. The reason for that is that we hypothesize that perhaps because their little rib cage is so tiny and breathing hasn't become something that is intimately wired into their reflexes as it is for you. Those centers in the pons and medulla oblongata, those tracts are very new, and in premature babies, they're not even completely, sometimes they're not even completely established yet. So if you put a baby to sleep on their stomach, what we hypothesize may be happening, not all the time, but may be happening, is that they're not able to get those reflexes to work and to expand that rib cage in order to send those signals back to the brain that says inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. They're not able to do that, and so they literally just forget to breathe. So that's why it's important to put them on their back, where it's much easier for them to expand and collapse their chest with the inhalation and the exhalation than it is if they're on their tummies, because they're just not all that strong yet. You know, they still have a lot more strength to gain. And if you've ever held a newborn, they are the cutest little tiniest thing, but they're floppy. They have like no neck strength. You have to support their neck. You have to support their back. They just don't have that musculature tone until they get a little bit older. And we also know that putting like stuffed animals and bumpers and all that crap and stuff in the bed, like for my daughter, only thing that, for my children actually, that they would have in their bed is that I always put them in a sleeper bag, and they had a sheet in there, and that was it. And maybe a light blanket I might put over them if it got really cold, but a lot of times between their pajamas and the sleeper sack, they were perfectly fine. I didn't put anything else in the bed, so no decorative ornamentation. If you want to do bumpers, I guess you could put them on the outside, but we didn't even fool with that. So all the little cutesy crap and stuff, we didn't even put that in there, because if they roll over or turn their face towards something, they might, once again, not get those signals to take an inhalation, take an exhalation, because there's something stuffed in their face, and that may be a cause of it as well. And sometimes you have babies that are put back to sleep, and mom and dad do everything right, and you still have poor little guy or gal, succumbs to sudden infant death syndrome. So it's one of those things that we're still, it's kind of a medical mystery, that we're still not exactly sure why that happens for some little people. So those respiratory reflexes that I was just talking about, some of them are chemoreceptors, are very sensitive to carbon dioxide, oxygen, or pH, the concentration of hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. We have baroreceptors in the aortic and carotid sinuses that are sensitive to changes in pressure, and that can control respiration. The stretch receptors in the lungs respond to exchanges in lung volume. Anything that's an irritant in your upper respiratory passage whether it's physical, someone putting their hand over your mouth, or it's a chemical stimulant, too much smoke or something in the room that can trigger coughing and trigger respiratory reflexes. Coughing is a reflex to kind of get these toxic things away from and out of your body. And other sensations, including pain, changes in body temperature, and visceral sensations can also control or alter your respiration. Hypercapnia is too much partial pressure in the arteries, so it's an increase in arterial partial pressure of carbon dioxide. It stimulates those chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata to increase your respiration so that you can blow off of this carbon dioxide and get rid of this excess carbon dioxide that you have. So it will help you, hypercapnia will help you to increase your respiration to exhale off more, get rid of more of this carbon dioxide and bring those numbers back down to normal. Hypercapnia and hypocapnia. Hypocapnia is the opposite end of hypercapnia. You have too little of CO2 that's in there. So instead of blowing off all that CO2, we want to breathe in more deeply to hold on to more of it, sort of thing. Hypoventilation, which is lower breathing, is a common cause of hypercapnia. So if you have this low ventilation, you're not having a good steady exchange of oxygen, your respirations are very low, so that can increase your carbon dioxide levels, which then will trigger the pons, the medulla oblongata, for you to do the opposite of hypoventilation, is hyperventilate. So an abnormally low respiration rate, and I'm going to star this because it helps you to understand this kind of relationship between hypocapnia and hypercapnia and hyperventilation. Low respiratory rate allows for CO2 to build up in the blood. Excessive ventilation or hyperventilation, the opposite end of hypoventilation, results in abnormally low partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So this is hypocapnia, and you're blowing off those hydrogen ions. You're not getting a chance for that adequate exchange to take place, where we saw that carbon dioxide plus water and carbonic anhydrase gave us a carbonic acid, and then that carbonic acid was broken down into bicarbonate ions, and then we have our hydrogen ions. We're getting rid of that. That process isn't happening as efficiently as we would like it to. So what will happen here is that we stimulate the chemoreceptors to decrease the respiratory rate. So there are things that are happening to decrease it. If you've ever seen someone hyperventilating, a lot of times they will give them, or like shows you've ever watched, they'll give them a bag to breathe into for, to hyperventilate. So what we're trying to do is that they have a low CO2 level, so we want to increase those CO2 levels, and by blowing into that bag, some of that CO2 that they're releasing off is coming right back to them when they breathe back into it, and that triggers the brain to slow down those ventilations and to get back to normal. So baroreceptors in the carotid and the aortic baroreceptors affect blood pressure and respiratory system, more starring time. When blood pressure falls, respiration increases. When blood pressure increases, respiration decreases. Protective reflexes, such as coughing, sneezing, laryngeal spasms, are all meant to keep chemical, mechanical stimulation, someone choking you or suffocating you, toxic vapors, all of that stuff is all meant to keep that from getting into your lungs. So those are just protective reflexes. And if you ever smell something funky or too much perfume, I remember my brother used to hate going to the mall with me and my mom because he said, oh, it makes me sneeze because you guys try on all those stupid perfume samples and it just irritates my lungs. And he would sneeze and cough as a result of that. Some of that he was just putting on because he didn't want to go to the mall. But some of it probably was a normal physiological response. Apnea is a period of suspended respiration. It's usually followed by an explosive exhalation to clear the airways. People that have sleep apneas, a lot of times it relates to snoring, a deviated septum in the nasal passages. Sometimes babies, new babies, when we talked about these tracks to their pons and medulla oblongata aren't fully established yet. Sometimes we'll have babies that will have a little bit of sleep apnea, and this is just kind of a normal thing that we see with them, and it's not very long for long. You watch your infant sleep, which I'm sure every new mom and dad just watch their infant sleep at some point in time. You'll see them take a real big breath, or it's like, you know, a couple of seconds or maybe milliseconds, not even that long, where they're not taking, you don't see their little chest rising and falling, and then you see them take a really big breath. So that's a little bit of that apnea. If you have apnea and it is problematic, then they can put you on machines to find out exactly why that is. Laryngeospasms are part of those protective reflexes. It temporarily closes the airway to keep foreign things from getting in. Problem in anaphylactic response is that if you're not getting foreign things in, great, but then you're also not getting any oxygen in. So that can be a problem, and that's why we give people that have really bad allergies an EpiPen, so that it can cause bronchial dilation and open those airways back up. So things that voluntarily control your respiration, strong emotions can stimulate the respiratory centers in your hypothalamus. Emotional stress can activate either sympathetic or parasympathetic division, causing either bronchial constriction or bronchial dilation. Hyperventilation can take place as a result of strong emotional events. So there is almost like there is some voluntary control, although most of your respiration are under involuntary control. You don't have any control over them. Even if you're anticipating a very strenuous exercise, that can increase your respiratory rate, your cardiac output, and just kind of kicks in your sympathetic nervous system. That fight or flight system just totally kicks in. I know a few years ago, my husband had me go into this boot camp that was being given for free by an ex-Marine. So needless to say, this boot camp was 2 hours of hell every Monday. And my husband, he's a national championship wrestler. He's always been very athletic, very, very high athleticism in him. And if he doesn't work out, he's a grumpy person. He's one of those type of people. Of course, he loved this. But I remember driving to the gym, and I would have like, I would feel myself being anxious about it because it was so hard. It was so very hard. Unfortunately, for me at least, that guy moved to Chicago. So he's torturing men and women in Chicago now. But I remember this actually happened to me, that I would have my heart rate increase. I could feel my heart rate increasing in my chest, and I can feel my respiration increasing. And this was happening even before the workout started. So just the anticipation of this exercise was causing these types of reactions in me. And you guys can probably relate to that, or maybe not. So a comparison between fetal hemoglobin and adult hemoglobin. There's a whole paragraph of this in your book. All I'm going to really mention is the fact that fetal hemoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen than adult hemoglobin does. And that's a good thing for your fetus because it's able to rob mom of the oxygen that it needs to grow and to get healthy, and for its cells to have the energy that it needs to become an infant when it's born just a few short months later. And this curve just shows that affinity, how like we have almost 100% oxygen hemoglobin saturation, so it has a very high affinity for oxygen, much higher than adult. And because we know this, we can take adult hemoglobin, if we can convert it back to fetal hemoglobin, we can help people that are anemic, especially people that have sickle cell anemia, or what's called thalassemia, which is another blood condition that affects the oxygen carrying capacity of red blood cells. We can use this and help them increase their oxygen carrying capacity. People that have, thalassemia or sickle cell anemia. So some changes that happen in the respiratory system at birth, keep in mind that before you are born, you're in a very watery aqueous solution. So there was no exchange of oxygen happening. A few weeks before you were born, you started to practice taking respirations, but all you were breathing in was amniotic fluid and you were breathing out amniotic fluid. So you never really had a shot at this whole rough, dry, harsh air thing that was happening. So the circulation through your body is completely different before you're born than it is when you're born. So some major events that happen before birth, or some things that happen at this point, keep in mind that your pulmonary vessels are collapsed. So those pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins that are going from the heart to the lungs and from the lungs back to the heart, those are collapsed because there's no air that's inside of them. Like I said, you practice breathing as a fetus, or like my little fetus is practicing breathing, but it's really just a movement of amniotic fluid. So it's just kind of exercising those intercostal muscles for the expansion and the collapse of their rib cage. Now, once baby is born and the connection to the placenta is lost, this is very important. That's why they want to make sure that why they clip the cord, because the placenta comes out after the baby is born. Why they clip that cord, and they want to do that as quickly as possible, because as long as baby is connected to mama, baby's going to just, well, I'll just steal mom's hemoglobin, or oxygen rather. I got pretty strong hemoglobin. I don't need to use this harsh cold air business and we do this crap. So as long as that's connected, then baby won't be forced to breathe. Those centers in their brain are not going to trigger them. Those apneistic and those pneumotactic centers, those respiratory centers in the pons and medulla oblongata, they're not going to be triggered to breathe. So we need to lose that connection to the placenta by clamping the umbilical cord. At that point there, they're not getting any more O2 from mama. So they're not getting any more of this oxygen from mom, so their partial pressure of oxygen falls and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide rises. Because we have this increase in partial pressure of carbon dioxide rises, and you've probably seen this. You notice babies, they have, and it happens very quickly, so you have to kind of really know what you're looking for. They're all kind of a white, slimy, bluish color. I have no other way to describe it other than that. So they kind of have this stuff all on them, the vernix, and then they're just so they kind of start to get blue, and they will pinken up after a while, but they're kind of a blue color because the carbon dioxide levels are rising, they're rising. Because we have this rise in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and then this decrease in partial pressure of oxygen on there, these baroreceptors and those chemoreceptors are going to trigger those reflexes in the brain, pons and medulla oblongata, that makes the baby scream out and take its very first breath. And so it's all of this stuff that's happening, and when baby screams out, that foramen ovale, that hole that's in the heart from the right side of the heart to the left side of the heart, or actually, yeah, from the right side to the left side of the heart, it's going to close up because we have that nice big scream. Those pulmonary vessels are now going to inflate because we have this nice big scream of this baby yelling, says, "I'm here, world, I'm here." So all of these things are triggering their brains to make this reflex to actually breathe. And so all that practicing they've been doing with those intercostal muscles is now paying off. Now, my last child, my youngest daughter here, she would not cry. So you've probably heard the old adage that the doctor slaps the baby on the butt. They don't really do that. I don't know if they ever did. Maybe they did. I don't know. But they rub them very vigorously. And I remember they let me hold her right after she was born. And I was kind of patting her back and just kind of trying to make her uncomfortable so she would cry. So she was the, and ironically, she does the most screaming of all my children now. But we had to really vigorously rub her to make her scream and cry so that she could take this first breath. So the newborn overcomes the force of surface tension to inflate their bronchial tree and their alveoli, take their nice first breath. There's a large drop in pressure after their first breath. Because of that drop in pressure that we talked about in the previous slide, that pulls blood into the pulmonary circulation, closes the foramen ovale and the ductus arteriosus. Ductus arteriosus connects the aorta with the pulmonary. It's a little, it turns into a ligament after you're born, but while you're a fetus, it's open, so that circulation just goes from aorta to pulmonary. It doesn't really have to go through this whole pulmonary circuit because A, those vessels are collapsed, and B, the lungs aren't getting any oxygen. So we redirect that fetal blood circulation pattern into what we call adult blood circulation pattern. And then those subsequent breaths that baby makes, and they watch baby very closely after baby is born to make sure that they're continuing to breathe, because breathing is, even though it's like, you know, commonplace for you and me for a newborn, it's a whole other world. So they have to make sure baby is breathing, and they'll monitor them and make sure that they stay nice and warm. And that could be just even on mom's chest, you know, the kangaroo care, but the nurses will stay around for quite a while to make sure that baby is breathing and taking the respirations that they need to, and everything is just peachy keen. All right, so here are those objectives. I won't go over those for you, but things you need to know. And that is the conclusion of the respiratory system. So next system that we will go over will actually happen in just a few short days, a few short weeks. Have a great morning, noon, or night.